Hello everyone, welcome to today's Level 11 talk number 13. The subject is Towards New Directions for a Sustainable Hospitality Sector. And I thought that I'd add a little addendum at the end just because where we are now in this place and time. So I thought I'd also talk about possible directions now that we're in this COVID-19 age as points of discussion. We're wanting everyone to be muted for this presentation, but encourage you to submit questions throughout, and then at the end, we'll look at those questions and have some discussion. I am Catherine Love, the Hospitality and Sector Leader for PTW. There are a number of reasons why people travel, and of course this travel has been occurring since the nomads were dwelling in caves. But we could say that the first reasons for travel generally were around the notions of commerce and empire expansion. The first known hotel, however, was in about 700 AD in Japan. So let's talk about the emergence of the reasons for travel for commerce and business, of course, have brought about the sector of the business hotels. So these have evolved over time to become more leisure hotels, where you combine, in encouraging the business person to stay for longer periods, you encourage that business and leisure combine. And this therefore creates a different need for the business hotel. It might be wanting to demonstrate more the attractions of that local environment. In this case, this was a competition we did for Bly Street. And this scenario was that we would have these business people coming and living in a fairly boring part of town, and really the desire would be to be more at the beach. And so we brought the beach to the hotel in this case. And obviously we're being asked a lot in hotels refurbishment around Sydney to combine business with leisure and provide options of where the hotel pool is up at the rooftop so that you can relax at the end of your day, whether you've been sightseeing or you've been in business meetings, and you can look at the icons around Sydney Harbour while sipping your cocktail. The idea of health in hotels in this period particularly is likely to become a very significant factor. Obviously, traditionally or more recently in hospitality, the ideas of spas have been about promotion of health. The idea of having a massage may not be something that is part of our COVID future, but there will be other ways of encouraging health and well-being, perhaps with social distancing. Places like Sydney, the city hotels are looking for major events, major art and culture events to be significant attractors. There could be a number of focus points. It could be art, it could be sport. These are the high attractors that cities like Sydney and Tokyo obviously have been bidding for to get big numbers of tourists coming in here. Not quite what we can do in this COVID time. The regional hotels and food and beverage facilities have also been promoting cultural events such as music and jazz festivals, operas in the Hunter Valley, etc., all to increase tourism regionally. And of course, this is going to be really important these days and in the foreseeable future, that we have those regional events happening so that we can travel both regionally within our state and hopefully later on interstate tourism as well. But the reasons that people want to travel are about points of connection. We've been looking at points of connection with cultural events in which large groups get together to celebrate music. But it could be on a more personal and perhaps in these COVID times, a more appropriate way is they would be connections with cultures, which can be a much more intimate experience. That might mean that the nature of your travel might be more intimate. It might be that you stay within the community and more authentically engage in that local culture. There is also an increasing desire to connect with nature. which has brought about, of course, another sort of offering which is very attractive to operators. Here we have glamping, which is very seductive, very romantic, but it's huge attraction to the operators because they can charge up to 3 times the rates for a building that costs very little or relatively little. So it's a very attractive proposition. Then there are the sorts of hotels that are more ephemeral and seasonal. I'm talking about the ice hotels, some of which you can only go there during the period that the ice is there, and clearly it disappears when the ice melts. The downside of tourist industry and what we're doing is that we are creating destruction. We're destroying the very ideas of nature that we're actually going out to seek. And so we must actually, in a socially sustainable environment, seek to protect these environments. I recently experienced this last year when I was very shocked to actually witness this sort of scene where there is such over-tourism. There are huge boatloads of cruise ships emptying out thousands of people onto, this is Santorini, of course, and they're emptying them out into villages that were never meant to sustain these sorts of populations. And the issue is that they don't even have the water supplies to sustain. They're small islands that don't even have potable water to be able to deal with these hordes of people that are overrunning the space. So there are obviously ways, whilst it is economically a huge attractor to the people on the island, they're making their fortunes, of course, having these amount of people there. Santorini obviously won't be able to cope under the new COVID social distancing requirements, which may be something that actually helps with more sustainable tourism in these sorts of places. And obviously some of the destruction that human beings are leaving on the planet is they're leaving their waste, they're polluting the waterways, and this becomes a disastrous cycle. So in a sustainable concept of tourism, we would be looking at having smaller footprints on the environments where we can leave these environments in good order for future generations. So some of the options of the way that we could do this is to take life at a slower pace, which has less carbon emissions, and do it in smaller groups that are more manageable, and perhaps then we can clean up after ourselves as we go. Also, we could be traveling in when we talk about these smaller groups, such ways of transportation would be, or can be, as this one in southern India. It's a more traditional form of travel using traditional materials and engaging directly the skills and resources of the local communities. This, of course, is the antithesis of that, when what I was talking about in this Santorini situation, where we have more and more larger ships welcomed by the communities, because this is bringing, in the short term, great economic windfalls. But the downside of this is what we've also been talking about. So other forms of travel, slower forms of travel, more less polluting forms of travel could be traveling by train. And it's not that the Shinkansens and the fast trains of Japan and China are also viable, but it's looking at ways that are alternative ways to flying, especially now because most flights are being grounded and a lot of airline companies are not even financially viable anymore. When we were all able to fly and the flights were becoming very, very accessible as a price point, this then opened up that the tourist market was available to a much wider group of people. Younger generations could actually afford to go and have their gap year overseas. And so this also increased the amount of hotels or types of hotels that we can see. There's a plethora of offerings that are actually becoming bigger and bigger to try and cope with the increasing demands of the diversity of age groups. So this has led to types although I'm talking there are multiple reasons that people travel, but it's bringing about those that are perhaps more traditional and loyal travelers in hotels such as Hilton, etc. But even those brands are having to introduce other brands that are more applicable to what the millennials are seeking as part of their travel experience. So we're talking about sustainable tourism. You'd have to question, given all the destruction that tourism places on the environment, why does it matter? Well, it matters because it's 10% of the global GDP. It provides 235 million jobs. It greatly assists developing countries. And pre-COVID, there were projections that 1.8 billion people would be tourists traveling by 2030. So because of what we've been talking about, the destruction, the over-tourism, what it's doing to many, many environments, I've just lightly touched on a few, there is a critical need for tourism to understand its negative impacts and take that on board and change. So why it must change is because of these icons. We're producing, as we've talked about, huge pollution emissions, which we need to take in hand and change. So sustainable tourism, this is a very simple diagram talking about the 4 points. It's environmentally friendly, it's got to be economically viable, it should be socially just, humane, and incorporate gender equity, and it needs to be culturally appropriate. Some of these points we've been touching on in the previous slides. We've talked about how the carbon emissions, of which it's more than just carbon dioxide, there's those 6 sorts of emissions that occur, and that this can be happening because of business travel, it can be happening because of the selection of our products, it can be happening because of the way that our transportation, where we're sourcing our materials from, and the type of waste production, a number of images that we've been talking about previously. In 2019, Foster's and Partners produced a methodology to measure emissions, of which they said that there were 7 components that they were looking at when they were setting up their tools to evaluate, including setup, structure, facades, services, operations, energy, and transport, some of which we've touched on lightly. Then there is the discussion about the UN Paris agreements, and that the issue is that building construction and operations represents 26% of the global emissions. And that one way to start looking at dealing with that is that if we could think about refitting, repurposing, then we could be helping to reduce that by between 30 and 40%. So sustainable solutions start with our strategies of infrastructure. One way of dealing with this is we may not have control over the external roads of our designs, but within internal resorts, the circulation, the vehicular circulation could start with things like don't cut back hills, work with the contours, use materials that allow for water retention, and don't build highways. The roads are inappropriate in scale to what their uses are required. So when we talk about sustainable solutions, projects that we've done in Bali, for instance, are rather lovely because there's this idea of scale and fit in the cultural context. So no building can be higher than the local pagoda. And using local materials and craftsmanship, which actually enhances the experience because then you are more aware of the authentic location that you're visiting in. So we talk about the business case, and this would be an ideal and has perhaps more relevance as a discussion or more hearing as a discussion when you're working in developed countries such as Australia. But when you're working in developing countries, it can be a challenge to talk about the sustainability of the environment as being an important factor economically. What we do and have been talking about with our Pan-Pacific clients is the creating biophilic buildings. So an example of this might be that you start with the master plan again and you're talking about working with clean waterways, putting in landscape parks that help reduce the pollution, the traffic pollution, etc. So breathing spaces through the development. This was a resort called Ang Sana in Vietnam. It's by Banyan Tree. This was one that I was working on where we were talking about the use of local materials such as bamboo. Historically, bamboo has had a bit of a bad feeling for developers in Vietnam because it's associated with poverty. So talking to these developers and saying, this is a really good sustainable material. It's there, it's immediately available, it's on site. And it gives you a warm facade that can speak just specifically to this context. The other side of that building was actually facing a jungle. So what we talked about was bringing the jungle onto the open corridors, because you can do that in tropical Vietnam, and bringing the jungle up so that these were harvestable walls. You can see there these little timber niches, which became the concept of tree houses within the jungle to enhance that corridor experience as you're walking along. This is the Malaya Hotel in Vietnam. We can take that authentic tropical experience through by using local materials such as bamboo, etc., into the interiors. So we're talking about how using local materials is a win-win for a number of reasons. One is that it's easily transportable, it's locally available. You're utilizing or reinvigorating the skills of the local craftsmen. And then you're building structures that actually fit within the context in a very beautiful way. In this case, it's the Six Senses Hotel in Vietnam. And here are other examples of Six Senses who are particularly have a very strong sustainability policy where their buildings really fit within the landscape. Doesn't mean that you have to go traditional. We could be using modern interpretations of traditional materials. This is the Wind and Water Pavilion by Vo Trong Nha, and he has succeeded where we haven't with some of our clients in the past. We could never get the idea of bamboo until Vo Trong Nha was able to do it in the regional areas and got it to be a popular material. This is very similar to a beach resort pavilion for an open cafe and restaurant that we also did in Vietnam. And these are some pavilions, the villas that I was talking about that help support the hotel. This is the villas for the Intercontinental at Phu Quoc, Vietnam. So what we've been demonstrating is that these become unique experiences where in this one of the great skills of the Vietnamese is their textile industry. So it's always showcasing what the local craftsman can do. What might then be the future materials of more urban hotels? It could be that we're using more sustainable materials such as CLT. Now that there are buildings 50 stories high being completed in Scandinavia, this could be a viable option for hotels of the future, as long as that is produced in pine forest locally and that you're not wasting resources on long transportation. This is a food and beverage facility that we're doing in a suburb. So we're talking about scale and fit and local materials. Of course, brickwork is fundamental to the material and cultural identity of suburban settings. The complexity is growing. It's becoming quite sophisticated in how we can evaluate sustainable outcomes. Obviously, we're about low energy use. An important concept is to do the measurement and verification of what we are saying to prove that this is working in a positive way, reducing the construction impacts, looking at low carbon energy supplies, and in the future, zero carbon balance. So we need to talk about circular economies and work well with good partnerships with our consultants who are actually creating really viable new pathways in the way we rethink whether a hotel room needs to have air conditioning, whether the guest can take more control of the room and control their environment. So in this trend of the circular economy, what we are trying to do is design out waste and pollution, keep products and materials in use that are locally sourced, and regenerate natural systems such as cooling breezes, etc. This is looking at, say, using district utilities, whether we can generate our own services on site, whether we can store the water and reuse it, as we've done in a number of buildings, such as One Central Park. There are a number of tools that we've got to help us in this, which is being legislated, but really those sorts of tools are actually staying still on the left-hand side in the red zone, where we're not actually improving the environment or being restorative or regenerative. So where we start our conversations with our clients is, where do you want to sit on this bar? And their operators like Six Senses are definitely wanting to have it as part of their core business, that they can talk about their sustainable principles. So how do we move forward? It's obviously through, this is a diagram by Northrop, which I thought was rather good. It's obviously not going to be, we can't take our clients necessarily through the big leaps. We may have to do it through baby steps and starting with now lowering our emissions, then looking perhaps by 2030 to get carbon negative, and now minimizing waste and then getting in over a 10-year plan to zero waste. Just wrapping up the last part of this talk, what is happening with 2020 COVID and what might be happening in the future? It has been a really dramatic year for Australia, of course. We started with the bushfires, which then you can see where the bushfires are and you can see where the food source is for our native habitat. So the flora and fauna was decimated in the billions. So obviously they're some of the major attractors to some of our areas. So this is a critical problem that we're dealing with. And then came the floods. So regional Australia has been crippled. It's on its knees trying to survive. Then came COVID. This is an out-of-date chart, but what's important to this discussion are these graphs where we're talking about who's getting it, but who's dying from it. And that may actually produce different pathways that hotels may go down. At previous conferences, when COVID first started in Australia, SARS had been in Singapore. So we looked at the JLL, looked at the recovery and was saying, look, it's all going to be good. Once we get through this, it's actually tourism's going to increase, as will flights. It all actually bumped up. So that's one line of argument. The second line is one that's been Dransfield released recently, where the blue were the predictions pre-COVID and the red is showing the impact of COVID. So obviously there's been a substantial impact. Again, the dotted lines are before COVID happened, and now the bars and the dashed lines are saying, well, this is the impact of what's happened with COVID and the slower rate of recovery. These are the RevPARs, so pre-COVID, it was all looking really good. This would be the mean, and obviously right in the midst of this now, and in the short term, the hotel rates are going to have to be much more competitive to get people to stay. So in the last few slides, what some UK architects are saying, COVID hotel will have a different look and feel. Lifts may not be what they were. We may need to change lifts so that they hold one person with their luggage. Our check-in will become much more electronic. Okay, so how long do you think it will take for the tourism industry to recover? Are we talking about regional, national, or international? And it will be dependent when things are getting open. In some ways, it's happening quicker on that the clubs are now opening, that we've got to 50 quite quickly that can come in here. And obviously it depends within New South Wales how New South Wales is recovering from all the bushfires regionally and how much impact there is there. If these border disputes happen, as I said, we'll be going to New Zealand before we go to Queensland. But projections for international travel, one terrible one that I heard Prime Minister Morrison said, we may not be getting onto planes again internationally until 2023. Dransfield is projecting that the recovery will be really slow, but they would hope that it would be in a better position 21, 22. It really depends when we're going to be feeling that we can safely travel internationally, and that's going to be up to the politicians. Okay, next question is, given that there will be more available rooms than guests, what do you see as the changes hotels will make to stand out from others around them? I'm going to be a bit perhaps controversial here. Australia has been in a very fortunate position, if we're just talking about Australia at the moment. It's had high RevPARs, it's had a really high occupancy rate, and it's had high daily rates. So in my opinion, we've got a little bit lazy about our product. Whereas I used to live in Shanghai, and Shanghai is a very sort of recent city, and the hospitality industry in Shanghai is also very recent. So everything is new, it's very glamorous. And when we think about Chinese visitors to us, although they are not the greatest numbers, they spend more when they come here, and their expectations are actually high. So we will have to raise our product at a time when we're not earning money. So the hotels will have to find ways that it's going to be attractive. What makes it a special attraction? And one way is to make it a much more authentic experience. What makes it stand out from the rest? I mean, there's been discussions about food and beverage as a lifestyle is very important. There are two streams of thought about whether you get in a signature restaurant, or whether if you're in Melbourne, what's the point of having a signature restaurant because there's so much good food around you. So it's got to be that the city works on what makes it a destination, and then the hotel needs to work with that too. And we're working now more from home. So the idea of co-working in the ground floor planes may not work so well in the future. It's up to, we've got to see what makes this more attractive. So I think it's about food and beverage, lifestyle, health and well-being are probably the keys. And health and well-being, I think, will be a really critical thing that they'll need to address. Okay, the next one that is up there is, for the Australian tourism industry, what are the top 3 things that it needs to do to promote itself? Well, that's what I've just sort of summarized. I think in this COVID age, it will be about health and well-being. And then it'll be people want to get out, and it's what they've been missing whilst they've been isolating in COVID-19. So we're getting to get that more intimate, more family. When I say family, that's probably the wrong word, but that you get smaller, more intimate experiences that can work with the social distancing. And then that you get this lifestyle that you've been missing, which is, I think, around food and beverage as well. Health and well-being, I think, will now be the primary thing. People will want to know that they're safe. Do you think the surplus rooms could be used for other uses out of home office rent? Yes, definitely. And there are already in Asia, it is very common now that the buildings that house hotels are actually multiple uses. So they're mixed use buildings, and that gives them the opportunity to actually change their use according to economic demand. So one of the ones that we were looking at in a competition recently, they had a hotel above a commercial area with some health and well-being in it. And then after more analysis, they decided that actually the commercial part was actually going to be more profitable than the hotel. So that obviously economic model can change if you've got a mixed-use building that can adapt to that sort of model of being agile. How do you see councils like the City of Sydney responding in terms of planning controls to facilitate change to accommodation that it will allow areas to open up quickly whilst responding to COVID restrictions? City of Sydney is one of the councils that is very much encouraging mixed-use buildings. So that agility is what I'm talking about. And City of Sydney have definitely gone through in their economic curves of fluctuations of how commercial or residential seem to taper, or which one it seems to be the dominant one. They've certainly repurposed buildings, so that the building that was down at World Square is an example in case. Originally it was designed to be an apartment building, and then it converted to a commercial building. So they have to be agile and responding to market needs. Okay, I don't know how they're going to quickly respond to COVID restrictions, but the hotels have actually been amazingly agile, because what they did is they lost all their income. They had 20% occupancy. So then they offered themselves as the isolation very quickly. And also I was really amazed to see that some of the hotels opened up to house the homeless people, which, as we're just about getting into the cold seasons, is a very noble gesture, I think. So there will be, apparently, according to Dransfield, hotels that have closed and will close permanently. But I think the hotels have actually been very, very quick to adapt to some of the circumstances, such as the Wentworth. It quickly became an isolation place, and they've been putting on concerts, etc., in a new way, so that people in the actual hotel rooms can actually see a concert going on their roof court, for instance, and they've been delivering to the hotel rooms. So there's no communal dining, but that's how they've responded. Okay, well, we think that's a wrap. So thank you everyone for joining in, and I think we'll make the link available to the film or the recording, so you can see it again. So thank you very much, everyone.